Most battles are decided by strength, numbers, and steel. This one was decided by a teenager with a rock. On a dry valley floor nearly 3,000 years ago, two armies stood facing each other in silence. Thousands of hardened soldiers waited for someone, anyone, to step forward and fight. But no one moved, because walking toward the center of that valley meant facing a man so large, so heavily armed, and so feared that entire ranks of warriors refused to challenge him. And yet the man who finally stepped forward was not a trained soldier, not a champion, not even an adult. He was a shepherd boy named David, a teenager from a small rural town who had never worn armor in his life. In the next few minutes, something would happen that soldiers would talk about for generations, historians would analyze for centuries, and believers would repeat across the world. But to understand how a shepherd boy ended up facing a giant warrior alone, we have to step back and look at the tense days leading up to that moment, when fear ruled an entire battlefield and hope seemed almost impossible to find. Across the valley stood the army of a powerful coastal nation, a people known for their iron weapons and their ruthless warriors. Their champion was a man called Goliath. Goliath was not just tall, he towered over everyone around him. Historical accounts describe him as standing well over 9 feet tall, wrapped in bronze armor that weighed more than most men could comfortably carry. His spear was massive, its shaft thick like a heavy wooden beam, and the metal head alone weighed as much as a small hammer. Every morning he would step forward from the enemy lines and shout a challenge across the valley. The rules of ancient warfare sometimes allowed two champions to fight on behalf of their armies, sparing thousands of lives from slaughter. Goliath used that tradition to humiliate the opposing side. Day after day, he walked into the valley and roared for someone to face him. Day after day, the soldiers on the other side remained silent. Leading the frightened army was a man named Commander Saul Bennett. Saul was supposed to be their strongest warrior. He was taller than most men in the army and had built his reputation through earlier victories. Yet even he hesitated to accept the challenge. 40 mornings passed with the same ritual. Goliath marched forward, shouted insults across the valley, and waited. The soldiers watched him from a distance, gripping their weapons but refusing to move. Some historians believe the psychological effect was even more devastating than the physical threat. Seeing a warrior that size every day slowly crushed the morale of the army. The men began to believe that defeating him was impossible. And once an army believes it cannot win, defeat is already close. Word of the humiliating standoff began spreading through nearby villages, where people whispered about the giant champion who had frozen an entire military force in fear. Miles away from that tense valley lived a teenager named David. David was the youngest of 8 brothers and spent most of his time doing the kind of work many people overlook. He watched sheep, long days under the sun, nights under the stars, guarding a small flock from predators. It was quiet work that required patience and courage. Wolves sometimes circled the hills, and wild animals occasionally threatened the flock. David learned to defend his animals using a simple sling made from leather straps and a pouch for stones. In skilled hands, a sling could launch a rock with tremendous speed, faster than many people realize. Archaeologists have found evidence that ancient slingers were capable of striking targets from distances that rival early firearms. But at the time, David was simply a shepherd boy trying to protect his family's animals. His older brothers had joined the army under Commander Saul Bennett, leaving David at home to help his father manage the farm. One morning, David's father packed bread, grain, and cheese into a cloth bag and asked him to deliver the supplies to his brothers at the battlefield. It was a simple errand. Walk to the valley, greet his brothers, hand them the food, and return home. David had no reason to believe that this small trip would place him in the center of one of the most famous confrontations in history. By the time he arrived, the sun had already begun climbing high above the valley. Soldiers were forming their lines again, preparing for another tense day of waiting. David moved through the camp searching for his brothers when a thunderous voice echoed across the field. Goliath had stepped forward once again. The giant's armor glinted under the sun as he shouted the same challenge he had repeated for 40 days. "Send out your champion," he demanded. "Send someone brave enough to face me." The valley fell quiet as thousands of soldiers watched from a distance. David listened carefully, trying to understand why no one answered the challenge. He expected at least one warrior to step forward, someone eager to prove their strength. Instead, he saw men turning their eyes away. Some tightened their grips and their shields, others shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. The fear was obvious. David turned to his brothers and asked why no one was accepting the challenge. They reacted with frustration, telling him to keep quiet and go back home where he belonged. From their perspective, David was just a teenager who didn't understand the danger. But David kept asking questions. Why was everyone allowing the giant to insult their army every day? Why was Commander Saul Bennett, the strongest leader among them, staying behind the lines? The answers he received were vague and defensive, and that confusion slowly turned into determination inside the young shepherd's mind. The more David thought about the situation, the more it bothered him. He had spent years protecting helpless animals from predators far larger than himself. He had chased away wolves using nothing but courage, quick thinking, and the small sling he carried on his belt. Standing there in the middle of the camp, hearing Victor Goliath's booming voice echo across the valley once again, David began to believe something the soldiers around him refused to consider. The giant might look unstoppable, but he was still a man, and men could be defeated. The thought sounded ridiculous when spoken aloud. A teenage shepherd challenging the most feared warrior on the battlefield. Yet the idea refused to leave David's mind. Eventually, the conversations about the young boy's bold words reached Commander Saul Bennett. Curious, and perhaps slightly desperate, Saul ordered that the boy be brought before him. When David entered the command tent, he found himself standing before the leader of the army. Saul Bennett studied the teenager carefully, likely expecting hesitation or regret. Instead, he heard something unusual. David calmly explained that he was willing to face Goliath himself. The room filled with disbelief. Experienced soldiers tried to reason with him, pointing out that Goliath had been a trained fighter since his youth, while David had never fought in a formal battle. David listened, but did not change his mind. He explained how he had protected his flock from lions and bears, animals strong enough to kill a man. Each time danger appeared, he fought back and survived. In his mind, courage and preparation mattered more than size. Saul Bennett looked at the young shepherd and realized something important. The boy standing before him was not afraid in the same way the soldiers were, and sometimes courage spreads faster than fear. Saul eventually agreed to allow David to face the giant, though the decision must have seemed unbelievable even to him. The commander ordered a set of armor to be brought out and placed onto David's shoulders. The metal plates were heavy and awkward on the boy's frame. David tried walking a few steps, but quickly realized the equipment slowed him down. He politely removed the armor and set it aside. Instead, he picked up the sling he had carried for years and walked toward a nearby stream where smooth stones lined the water's edge. He selected 5 small stones and placed them carefully into a pouch. The army watched from a distance as the young shepherd began walking down into the valley. Thousands of eyes followed his slow steps toward Goliath, who stood waiting with a grin that suggested he could hardly believe what he was seeing. Before we go further into this moment that would change everything, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.